I'm Nancy Bell, and along with Linda Sula, am co-chair of the Climate Change Committee. And I just wanted to give you all a heads up about our climate change speaker series, which is open to all members. It's the third Tuesday of the month at 11 a.m. And we bring in local experts to share with us how climate change is directly impacting Marin and what's being done to address those impacts. So this is our way of educating ourselves so we can better assess where the league's work regarding climate change in Marin will be most impactful. So please check the chat. We'll have some links in there where you can go to register for our April 20th meeting and just find out more about the Climate Change Committee. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Nancy. Does anyone else have an announcement they'd like to make? I don't see anybody waving their hands around madly. Okay. All right. Well, I am going to turn this meeting over to Nancy Bell. Nancy, you're muted.
All right. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. On behalf of the Climate Change Committee and Linda Sula and myself, we really appreciate your being here today. And I think you're going to find it to be quite compelling. I first heard today's speaker, Mark Bartolinie, when he spoke to the Marin Commission on Aging this past February. And in that presentation, he talked about the global aspects of climate change and health and the inequities of response to help the millions of people who will suffer the most. So how do we mitigate those inequities? Right now, there are far more questions than answers, but today Mark is going to share with us his international experience dealing with large-scale disasters and what needs to be done to meet the challenge of climate change-driven disasters. So Linda is now going to introduce Mark.
And I'll even remember to unmute myself. Hi, I'm Linda Sula, and thank you, Nancy, appreciate that. Helping us better understand how profound this issue is, our speaker today is Mark Bartolinie. He's the founder of Prepare, its initiative aimed at building alliances in the international humanitarian response community, focused on adapting systems to meet the growing challenge of climate-driven disasters. During Mark's 30 years of experience in the field of international disaster response and humanitarian assistance, he has worked in war zones and on natural disasters in over 70 countries. He also has years of experience in Washington, D.C., working on policy and advocacy issues related to refugees and displaced persons. As a vice president for the New York-based International Rescue Committee. Mark received an appointment to be the director of the Office of U.S. Foreign Disaster Assistance in U.S. Aid during the first term of the Obama administration. And following his service at U.S. Aid, he was appointed to the President's Advisory Committee on Voluntary Foreign Aid. He is a native of Marin and a graduate of UC Berkeley. As Lynn mentioned earlier, if you have questions during the presentation, please enter them in the chat. We'll keep an eye on it. If there's anything urgent that needs to be addressed, then we'll call on you. Otherwise, we'll read them to Mark after his presentation. If you would like to ask the question yourself, just enter a question mark in the chat and we will ask you to unmute yourself and ask your question at the appropriate time. Mark, thanks for joining us today, and it's all yours. Please unmute yourself.
Thanks, Linda, and thanks, Nancy. I did remember to unmute myself. That's good, a good start. I look forward to speaking with you today about this really critical topic. So in the climate change world that I work in, which is primarily focusing on humanitarian crises around the world, there's still considerable debate about what exactly climate change will bring. Some of it is just are unknown issues, and some of it are policy debates on how things will evolve. But there are some definitely consensus opinions that are there. And one that's very important is that there's no getting around the fact that we are going to suffer at least, and already are in the process of, 1.5 Celsius degree increase in global temperature. And that's simply by the dint of the fact that that's the amount of greenhouse gases that are currently in the atmosphere and what scientists have predicted they will produce. And we know that it's going to be greater than that. We just don't know how much at this point. As I've said, there's still considerable debate about a number of issues around climate change, some of which I'll get into in my talk. But we do know from that, just that 1.5% degree increase, that we're going to be suffering an ever greater number of hydrometeorological events. And those of us living in California, which I think really is one of the epicenters in the United States of climate change, we know what that means in terms of drought. This year, we're certainly seeing it, particularly worrisome, one of the worst ones I think we faced. And of course, our fires and also our ocean conditions, which don't get a lot of discussion, but the conditions in the Pacific are really, truly worrisome in terms of species loss and other environmental degradation. But my focus today is more on the international side. So with that local introduction, let me just talk a little bit about the types of disasters that we're already seeing and will continue to see in not only greater number, but greater severity. In the UN nomenclature system, they're called L3, level 3 disasters. And the office that I used to direct at USAID, we would send out what are called disaster assistance response teams to virtually every level 3 crisis there was. And maybe 15 years ago, 20 years ago, if you had 2 of those a year, that was a big year. The last several years, there's been 7 or 8 a year. And it's just completely taxed the system, not just of the US government, but of foreign governments around the world, of humanitarian aid organizations. We're facing a level and severity of crises that are really unprecedented. And they're everything from drought to famine to water scarcity, heat events. Heat events don't get a lot of press, but there was one in Europe several years ago that killed thousands of people. And we're seeing more and more of those. And I'll talk a bit about one today that was particularly interesting as a case study. Fires, as I mentioned, storms. We had this horrific hurricane, was it 2 years ago now, in the Bahamas, a place I'd spent time in, that just devastated it. It was unique in terms of how long it hovered over one particular area and the severity. And that's something that scientists would directly relate to warming oceans and climate change. Desertification. We're seeing that in places all around the world. I've seen it in the Sahel region in Africa, in Niger and other places. And it's just horrifying to see. I've seen hundreds and hundreds of women and children out digging holes in this arid desert as the Sahara moves further south to try to make water permeate into groundwater more effectively and make the agricultural system more viable. And it's a battle that is going to be lost ultimately in many of these places. Salinization is a big issue. Food security is huge. Loss of agricultural production and fisheries. Fisheries is extremely concerning, what we're seeing. Floods, of course, inundation from sea level rise. I'll talk a bit about that later on in the talk. Mudslides. Obviously, there's been a significant loss of biodiversity associated with climate change, and that will only continue. And then diseases. And I know with what we're facing right now with SARS-CoV-2, that's one on everybody's mind. And unfortunately, we're going to see probably more pandemics related to climate change, as diseases are able to transmit borders into areas that haven't previously occurred. You've got air pollution from fires, which I'll also talk a little bit about further today, because there's been a lot of death associated with that really hasn't been well covered, I don't think, by the media. Allergens, vector-borne diseases, food and waterborne diseases, mental health. And mental health is something that I think we're really underplaying. And we're seeing that in the COVID crisis and also in our climate change crises here in the United States. And it's a global phenomenon. I think mental health is going to be a huge component of growing impacts from climate change. Food security, I mentioned, and I will talk a bit more about famines, but famines are one of the worst things you can experience as a human being. I've been to several now. When I was director, I had the Somalia famine on my watch, and 260,000 some people roughly died in that famine. And of those, over half were children under 5. We're going to talk about vulnerability a bit today, I will, and children are the most particular vulnerable group in a famine. It's a horrific sight to see. And we're facing potentially 2 new famines in the world today. and I mentioned fires, and there's so many elements of health around fires and heat events, and I'll get into that a little bit as well. So here we are facing these just monumental challenges. I think next to global thermonuclear war, climate change is the gravest existential threat currently facing the planet. And we just went through 4 years of, to a significant degree, wasted time. My colleagues in the US government, in the State Department and USAID and elsewhere, they weren't even allowed to use the phrase climate change. They had to use weather-related events. And we pulled out of the Paris Agreement. So that didn't take place, and President Biden has now reinstituted our participation in that, which I think is very important. But really, it was a lost period where so much could have been done, and there is a time frame on this. There are tipping points that scientists have recognized where if we don't get certain benchmarks in, we're going to face even more severe and sometimes undefinable consequences. The one organization within the US government that's been able to function was the Department of Defense. There's numerous hearings you can see online where some of the climate change deniers in Congress grilled defense officials for their budgets for climate change. And those officials, to their credit, pushed back and said, you know, our job is to deal with and plan for the greatest threats facing this country. And absolutely climate change is one of those. And we'll talk a bit about that today in terms of instability, of conflict, and how climate change will most definitely exacerbate many, many concerns for our national security globally. But like I said, fortunately, we're seeing a shift back to taking this far more seriously and aggressively. One of the things in terms of, in addition to frequency and scale of events, are the complexity of events. And there's a number of factors sort of beyond climate change that are adding to that as well. And I'm talking about urbanization, population growth, socioeconomic issues that we're looking at globally. But those are adding to the complexity of responding to these events as well. And let me just give you one example that sort of is a compilation of issues that happen in an event. And it's the kind of new normal that we're going to be seeing more of. In 2010, there was an absolutely unprecedented heat event in Russia. The temperatures were off the charts. They'd never been recorded so high. And those sparked fires. And those fires created, I mentioned this a minute ago, there were 5,000 people alone that died in Moscow related to smoke from the fire that weren't directly next to the fires, but just the ancillary smoke from miles and miles away. And we saw that last year in our fires in Northern California, where there were 1,500 to 3,000 people that died, mostly elderly, all with pre-existing conditions that died from smoke-related causes. That's a new normal that we're also unfortunately going to be seeing. So in this Russian event, these fires ended up having massive implications for Russia's grain crop. And Russia is one of a top producer globally for exporting grain. At the same time, you had droughts in China and in another country, what was it? Canada and Pakistan had flooding that ruined their grain crop. And China and another country had major droughts that also, it was Australia, that impaired their grain crop. So all of a sudden you have these huge global shocks in terms of the price of grain on the global market. A country like Mozambique, which is almost entirely dependent on imports, was significantly hit. Major disaster, food security crisis in Mozambique. You had the MENA region, the Middle East and North Africa region, which imports about 50% of their grain, got really hammered by this as well. Prices went up, huge shocks to very basic commodities like bread, which is a staple in those countries. And there's a famous story, which you may be familiar with in Tunisia, tragic story as well, of a Tunisian. He actually was selling vegetables in a market, and the government came and tipped over his cart and tried to steal his vegetable crop that he was trying to sell. And he protested by setting himself on fire in front of a government office. And that sparked protests throughout the Middle East. It unleashed, and for a number of factors, certainly this isn't just a climate change issue, but climate change was a big player in this. And to highlight that, one of the hallmarks of these protests were people holding loaves of bread that they could no longer afford. And without a doubt, while this was an ongoing building problem, the impact of the climate events in Russia and China and Australia and other countries played into this. And it obviously created terrible instability. There were lots of social justice issues at play. But that really was one of the drivers of the Arab Spring. Now, I mentioned earlier, there's a lot we don't know still, and a lot that scientists are still looking at. And climate change critics often point to the fact that climate change activists are attributing everything that happens in the world today to climate change. There's some truth in that, I think. I mean, I've seen reports, for instance, on Syria that cite the drought in Syria as being really the cause of the Syrian civil war. And I've worked on Syria now for 10 years. That's not the case. There were a lot of issues that tragically pushed that country into civil war. And while climate change certainly played a role in it, you couldn't say it's the key driver. And scientists are very loath to identify something without the appropriate evidence to back it up. So in terms of conflict, most scientists today will say it's still very unclear what role climate change will play. However, I think all of them will agree it's going to be a driver, and it's going to be growing as a greater and greater driver. And that's one of the reasons why you're seeing entities like DoD and militaries around the world really looking at these impacts and where things are going, because it's going to have massive national security implications. Also, you have major political implications in these crises, and we have numerous accounts of politicians losing their jobs, of regimes falling due to major disasters that weren't managed well. And that can be good or bad depending on what the circumstances are in the country, but either way, it leads to instability, and that's something that is of grave concern. So who are the people that are going to be most impacted by climate change? First of all, in every natural or man-made disaster around the world that we respond to, it's always the most vulnerable groups that will pay the greatest price. Their coping skills are less. I mean, there's a terrible statistic where in the poorest countries in the world, by analysis showing the exposure to natural disaster threats that they face, they're only facing like 11% of the natural disaster threats globally. Yet in the natural disasters that do occur in those countries, they're responsible for 50% of the deaths globally from natural disasters. So that gives you a sense of how impactful crises. Now, it's not to say that a fire isn't going to burn, whatever's in its path. Of course it will. But those that are most vulnerable in a fire will be the elderly, people with disabilities who have difficulty escaping quickly. And then after the fire, those who have the least coping skills to deal with the after effects of a fire. And we see that same phenomenon globally, where those with the least coping skills, the least resources, are the ones that will pay the ultimate longer term price, and often mortality rates in those groups. Now, it's also important to point out that oftentimes vulnerability is very context specific. I mentioned earlier about famine in children. That's just a fact that we've been able to record in our response to famines over the years, that children under 5 are the most vulnerable. I mentioned forest fires in elderly and disabled. I was in Honduras a couple of years ago working, and in the barrier islands off Honduras and Nicaragua, the Mosquito indigenous population are suffering significantly already from climate change. They're very low-lying atolls that they're living on, and they're already inundated. Their fresh water sources are already inundated with salt. They're suffering greater and greater impacts from storm surges in the Caribbean. And horrifying and interestingly, some of the most vulnerable populations in these areas are young men. And the reasons that they're the most vulnerable are really economic ones. They've been exploited by large conglomerates that have gone down there, and they hire Honduran and other Caribbean fishing companies to fish for lobster. And they use scuba tanks, and they don't have any safety protocols. And so often, even though they know there's risk with this, they'll be diving multiple times a day without taking precautions against the bends. And they've gotten the bends in huge numbers. And it's not a very well told story, but it was amazing in looking at these communities and doing vulnerability mapping. When there is flooding and the like, how do we get people out quickly? It was some of the young men in the community who were the most at risk, because either they died, or if they didn't die, they had severe disabilities. And these lobsters are sold in companies and restaurants in the US like Red Lobster and the like. Now, to be fair, they've cleaned up their act a little bit, some of these chains, and have realized the problem and have tried to eliminate purchasing lobsters from companies that are engaging in these practices, but it's still ongoing in terms of other chains that are purchasing this. So, that's just one example of how vulnerability can often be very context specific. So let me talk about a couple of other groups that are particularly vulnerable, I think. One are refugees, and globally, there's over about 1.5 million, not 1.5 million, well more than 1.5 million, 100 million refugees, and internally displaced people as well. But refugees, they have a certain legal status under the Geneva Conventions and under the refugee conventions that not all countries have signed, but many have. That's certainly no guarantee of safety, but it does give them something. And I mentioned I spent a lot of time on the Syria crisis, and all of Syria's neighboring countries have huge refugee populations now that they're hosting, Jordan and Lebanon, and in particular Turkey. And in the early part of the war, Turkey was incredibly inviting. I wouldn't say they wanted them to come, but they were incredibly generous to incoming refugees. In fact, so much so that it was unsustainable. I was trying to work with them on that. They were spending so much on it. If the crisis grew, which it did, it was clearly going to be unsustainable. But from that standpoint, to 2 years, they started shooting refugees at their border, despite these legal protections that are in place. And Europe obviously completely shut down. There were ships flying the Mediterranean trying to help refugees who were escaping on small boats, very dangerous, many drowned. And the European Union just shut that down and won't allow them at all now. So, there's a huge problem in terms of vulnerability with refugees. And I'll talk about migrants in a bit, which are even more complex. But refugees also, there's many places in the world where there's what are called long stayers. There are Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, outside of Cox's Bazar. We're over 1 million refugees in this one camp. And it's well known in our community that it's particularly vulnerable to climate change and to a massive cyclone that would just come through and cause, incredible devastation. So that's something, it hasn't happened yet, but it's something that we're extremely concerned about. And in another country like Kenya, where they have 2 huge camps, basically small cities, the Dadaab and Kakuma camp up in the northwest, that host hundreds of thousands of refugees. Those are also very vulnerable to climate change implications. Now let me move to migrants. And migrants are, I think, probably the most complex and going to be one of the most challenging aspects of climate change. I mean, we're already seeing it. And this is really going to play into our discussion in a few minutes about equity. But migrants, there is absolutely no legal protections whatsoever. They have no status, legal status within the international system. Now, it's true that there are laws regarding asylum, and if a migrant comes, as we're seeing right now in the US and have been for years, comes to our border, we have a legal requirement under the treaties that we've signed that we at least do an interview, and essentially we're looking for the types of qualifications that would qualify them as a refugee, even though they're asylees. It's the same qualifications, which are a well-founded fear of persecution, and economic issues don't qualify. Nor does it the fact, let's say it was one of these people I mentioned earlier coming from the barrier islands of Nicaragua and Honduras, and their island has been inundated. That's not going to qualify them for access into the United States. So there's no protections for these people, and there's no solution here. So I'll talk about it over the next few minutes in various ways, but the numbers that we're predicting are staggering. We're looking in the next 30 years, less than 30 years, to see between 150 million to 1 billion migrants due to climate change related causes. And you can imagine just with what we witnessed in Syria and the destabilization. I mean, you look at the politics in England in terms of Brexit, in terms of kind of populism that's been growing in Hungary and other places in Europe. A lot of that can be tied to migrants coming from North Africa and elsewhere that have put a lot of pressure on European governments. And of course, we've seen that in our own government over the last 4 years in terms of how migrants and refugees have been vilified. And there's every expectation that's going to be a growing problem as these numbers increase. So, and without a legal framework, it makes it all the more complex to manage it. There have been some efforts in the United States and Congress to introduce legislation to try to provide some sort of a framework. But to date, they've been not very well received by many members of Congress, so they haven't gone anywhere. But at least it's on the radar. Let me tell you about another interesting, because I think it plays into this issue, an interesting predicament that one population finds. And the Marshall Islands in the middle of the Pacific, it's where we did atomic testing in the 40s and 50s. In fact, there were 67 atomic tests in the Marshall Island chain during about a 12-year period. And the Marshallese have sued the US government, I think something along the lines of 60 different cases, and won virtually every one of them except one. And the US has signed what's called a compact free association with Marshallese Islanders. And what that is, it allows them to come and work without a work permit or without immigration status in the United States. And when you consider what we did there, basically, destroying many of their habitats, many of them were sent back to their islands, not knowing that there were still radiation issues, and then were studied by the US government to see what the radiation impacts would be. And obviously there's been huge health issues involved with this population. I got to know a lot about it because the office that I directed, it used to be FEMA's responsibility, and before I got into office, they transferred it to our office. So I went out to understand what it is that we were going to have to get involved with. And already some of these islands and they're very low-lying atolls have already become uninhabitable now due to sea level rise. And so we're seeing a growing number of, and it's not a huge population, it's about 160,000 Marshallese, but a third of them now are already living in the United States. But it's an interesting dynamic, I think, what we've set up, this compact of free association. And how does that play into what I've just been discussing, in terms of, I think it's a case where we recognize that we had a responsibility after what we had done, whatever justifications you want to, many people say it was justified, but we did some really horrific things out there. And now let's look at climate change and who's responsible for climate change. So this is all well documented, dating back to the study started in terms of analyzing it in the late 1700s. The United States, by far and away, has been the greatest contributor to climate change, to global greenhouse gas emissions since our early industrialization. We're responsible from, depending on which study you read, 25 to 28% of the greenhouse gases that are currently in the atmosphere. Now today, China doubles the amount of greenhouse gases that we're producing. We're number 2, and China is number 1, but China actually is well behind us in terms of their historic contribution because they are so recently developing in such a significant way their infrastructure. The European Union, if you look at 27 states, they're second at about 22% of the historic contribution to greenhouse gases. So I've talked a little bit today about the implications of climate change in terms of the most vulnerable. And here we are, the single greatest emitter over time. And yet we're saying to people that come to our borders, tough luck. You're bringing all these terrible things. Well, I think there's certainly a case to be made that there's a responsibility there. And I'm not suggesting that we have open borders and everybody who wants can come to the United States. I honestly don't think that's a viable position either. But let me turn a minute back to refugees. And I mentioned the Global Compact, which I think is an interesting, the Compact of Free Association for the Marshallese. I think that might be something interesting along those lines for migrants, a certain number of migrants. And how would we go about creating something like that? Well, we have the United States Refugee Assistance Program. And it really came into being after World War II. And we set a ceiling every year for the number of refugees, and that ceiling is very greatly. The Trump administration tried to virtually destroy the program. It was down to less than 10,000, but historically the numbers have been between 70 and 120,000 to 150,000 a year of refugees that are allowed into the United States. And the US had played until the last administration, but is starting again, played a critical role in terms of setting the tone globally for addressing this really key population of people who really don't have other alternatives if they're being driven out of their home countries due to fear of persecution for any number of things. Mostly it's political violence, but it's also now gender-based violence, sexual and gender-based violence, other attributes can qualify you as a refugee. So there's a system that was set up with a certain number. And what we saw is a number of other countries, about 20 other countries globally participated in refugee resettlement. And the higher the US set their ceiling, invariably other countries increase their ceiling as well. I think the US played an important lead role in this. I think we can do the same thing with migration. We need to establish some sort of legal status for migrants, migrants that really have no options, and look at what we can do globally. The other thing, of course, and this is what the Biden administration is doing today with respect to what's happening on our border, is we have to look more at the countries who are the most vulnerable and figure out ways we can help mitigate the impacts that they're facing that are driving them out of their countries so that they can stay living in their countries. And the challenge with climate change is there's been a significant reduction in global poverty over the last 30 years. And despite what some critics of development say, there's been tremendous strides in vaccinations and other things that have helped increase longevity, especially of children globally. And climate change is really going to do damage to that, to the development world and some of these benchmarks and metrics that we've been able to establish. I'm not sure if I mentioned, I should have, I didn't earlier, about one of the vulnerable groups being women. Women are, it depends on the country, but the more developing a country is in the global south, the more women are vulnerable in those countries. They're more vulnerable to suffering from extreme poverty. And in many of these circumstances, you see women are the ones that are collecting firewood, they're doing the cooking, they're doing the food gathering, and they're playing the critical role in keeping a family alive. And they're the ones that are going to be the most impacted. And obviously also there's inequities in many of these societies in terms of the role of women that play into their vulnerability. And so there's a huge role, there's definitely a gender gap associated with climate change. And there's been a number of interesting studies of that of late as well. So, there are opportunities. Inclusion and capacity building are two key elements of this, and that certainly includes the role of women. But, and I'm going to say one more thing before I want to not go on too long, and I'll sum up. But among the responses that we're looking at for climate change, there's two key ones, adaptation and mitigation. So adaptation is things, we call it disaster risk reduction. And there's a number of evidence-based studies out there, programs that for a very small amount of money, we're able to save huge amounts of life. One, just off the top of my head, it was in Bangladesh, which had removed a lot of its mangroves in the coastal areas. And I mentioned earlier the threat of cyclones in this one refugee camp. You get cyclones coming through the Bay of Bengal and just they've killed hundreds of thousands of people. But by restoring these mangroves, it's like a barrier reef almost in terms of protection. And it saved tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of lives. And there's a number of examples like that of relatively small interventions, small scale interventions that have proved very effective at saving lives. So disaster risk reduction is certainly a part of it. I'll just very quickly say about what I'm working on Prepare. We're looking at something very specific, and that's the system of humanitarian response itself, the UN organizations, the international organizations, the governments, the various players that you'll see in an international response. Look at what's happened in COVID and how even, obviously there were huge leadership issues, political issues that impacted the response. And leadership is a big issue in terms of the strains. That's made it more complex for getting a good leadership in these crises because there's so many of them. But you have systemic failures. In the United States, we've been preparing. It was never a question of when, if, only when a pandemic like this would hit. It was not a surprise to those of us in the field. Yet some of our systems, like the National Security Stockpile, completely collapsed. Goran, which is the WHO's early warning system, failed. It's done some other good things since the failure, but it failed initially to warn us in time. And there's a multitude of things I can point to. And so improving our systems to prepare and respond to these events are critical. But I have to say that inclusion is critical, capacity building, all these things. But in the humanitarian world, I'm so used to being called out as somebody who was a senior manager for things that go wrong, and really there are things that we just can't manage. The scale of it and the cause of it are things that have to be dealt with politically. And that's one of the reasons I was so interested in talking to this group today, because as voters, you are really the key in the United States, not just for our own domestic issues, but also for international issues, because we are such a big player in the international realm. But there's issues that politicians are going to have to deal with, and it really goes to mitigation. And mitigation is reducing the root causes of climate change. Unless we're able to significantly reduce the trajectory we're on, the crises that'll be coming are simply going to be beyond overwhelming. There'll be events that we can't even predict today, I'm sure of, in their scale and their impact. So mitigation is one of the key. And let me say a couple things. I'm trying to figure out how I want to wrap up on, I really admire Greta Thunberg and some of the stuff I've read. And she said something that I think will resonate with all of you being Northern Californians. She said, we really thought when climate change got bad, when it really started having impacts that people could feel locally, that finally we would start changing things. She said, but look at Australia, look at California, look at what they've incurred, and nothing has changed. And I think that sadly, I wouldn't say nothing has changed. There's certainly certain things in motion, but very little has changed, certainly not near enough to the kind of changes we need. And I hate to single out, and there's a lot of politicians I could single out, but I'm going to single out one just because it's something that was in the news and I think is really relevant, and that's Senator Dianne Feinstein. I don't know if you saw when she was addressing, about a year or two ago, I think, addressing a group of school children from the Sunrise Movement who were challenging her on climate change. And she pushed back, and it was so unfortunate, the whole episode. It was a Saturday Night Live skit. But she said, I've been in this for 30 years. I know how things work, and I know what's possible. Well, the thing with climate change is we have to change our politics to make the impossible possible. We have to change the current paradigm, or we're never going to be able to get beyond what we're facing. I'll tell you one other story, and that is I responded to the Japanese earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear incident as U.S. government humanitarian response director. And I was with a high-level delegation in Sendai, outside of Tokyo, and we were given a briefing by the head of the Japanese self-defense forces. And he said, we prepared for a 100-year event, and we got hit by a 500-year event. And I think there's a lot in that statement. First of all, Japan knew they had especially acute vulnerability to tsunamis. So they did a tremendous amount of work preparing for them. They did some really ingenious, amazing things in terms of gates that would close and all sorts of very expensive adaptation work. Yet it was overwhelmed because the event was so much greater than what they expected. And it wasn't climate change related, obviously, but it does have huge resonance for what we're facing in climate change. And, let's face it, there are some events we're simply not going to be able to afford to respond to. And that may have been the case. I don't know. I knew the analysis on it, but in terms of what they faced in the March tsunami of 2011, it may have just been of such a scale that, moving people from the coast, not building on the coast, or creating adaptation was not viable. I don't know, but that could have been the case. But how does that apply to climate change? Well, I would just say, ask yourselves, how much would you spend on protecting your children and your grandchildren and future generations? Because that really is what's at stake here. I know there's people out there that don't see this as the same existential threat that many of us working on it do. But I'm convinced from the science and from what I've witnessed globally, I've traveled to 140 some odd countries now and seen a lot in terms of climate change impacts. It's already here, it's growing, it's getting worse, and it's something that we can deal with, but we have to make really radical changes in terms of how our systems and our politics work in order to do it. So with that, I hope I didn't overextend my time, but I'm happy to take any questions if anyone has any.
Linda, are you gonna lead this?
Yes, okay, just a reminder regarding the questions, enter them in the chat. If you would like to ask a question yourself, just enter a question mark in the chat and we'll unmute you and you can ask your question at that time. I have a question locally in Marin, bearing in mind everything that you just said. Do you have any suggestions what we can do now to help stop accelerating the climate change crisis?
Well, I think, what I just related in terms of the politics of climate change is very much, I mean, it's in every county and every state in the country. And I've been working on one issue in particular, so I'll be quick about it and won't bore you, but I'll just say, from my experience, if you look at what's happening to our national park here, the Point Reyes National Seashore, there's a plan that the National Park Service is going to implement based on a couple of politicians' insistence. They've been at it for a long time, which will expand ranching in the seashore. And, ranching is already a significant contributor to climate change. The IPCC reports are very clear on that. But I think in this case, it transcends that particular issue, the impact of climate change from ranching. What I see, and I mentioned this earlier, and we've seen this already, if you look at the mental health implications from COVID, from climate change in the United States, it's been less severe in Marin. I've looked into that, but it's still there and it's going to grow. The resource that a national park, there's plenty of evidence on the mental health benefits that accrue to people. In fact, the Park Service itself touts this, both the mental and physical health benefits, but the mental health benefits, you can actually build resilience by going to a national park, experiencing it. And I think what we're doing with it is actually degrading this park. And I used to be, a full disclosure, I was director of the Point Reyes National Seashore Association for a couple of years. And we would bring out several thousand children a year from around the Bay Area, from underserved communities on scholarship. Children from Pinole, from Richmond, who are suffering from environmental injustice, being located in areas where industry is polluting their waters, is creating health problems, is reinforcing endemic extreme poverty. And here we have the one national seashore on the Pacific coast, and we're degrading it when we bring those children out. And there's been recent reports of the toxic runoff from the ranches, of species loss, various implications. But I'm not going to dwell on that anymore. But that's one of many, many issues I think we're facing here in Marin that could easily be dealt with if there was political will. But the political will is running in the other direction.
And from Kay, she's asking, what is Al Gore up to these days? When he lost the presidency, wasn't that the turning point toward disaster?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting question. I could certainly talk about that for a while, because it did change the world, I think, where we went, given Gore's loss in that election. When you look at Iraq and the Middle East, where we went as a country in terms of the money we spent and everything. But I don't know what he's up to these days. I still hear that he's still out there. He's still championing issues around climate change. But I can't answer beyond that much.
Okay, great. And from Joan, how do we keep the young people involved in climate change?
Well, I think that's a great question. And I talked earlier about inclusion and listening in terms of gender issues and vulnerable groups. And young people, I think, many of them are very involved with this because they understand that this is their future that's on the line. And so I think just listening and trying to engage with them, I think they are going to be critical to the solution. Let's face it, I'm getting older. My generation has not done a great job, is one of the worst understatements I could possibly make. We've been horrifyingly deficient in responding on our children's behalf to this threat. And so, I think it's a question of not only engaging them in terms of trying to understand it and trying to look at solutions that are going to be effective, but helping them through the mental health implications. Because I do worry that children today are facing so many things. And I think we're seeing a lot more psychological issues with children. And I think it's also incumbent to say, which I think is true, it's dark in terms of what we're facing in terms of climate change and other major issues, but it's not insurmountable. If the will is there, if we really start making the changes we need, we can overcome the worst consequences of this. And I think children need hope. And I also think there's great complexity I mentioned. You know, I don't want to go too much into this issue, but there's lots of solutions I see out there, and some of which I'm familiar with, some of them I'm not, where some of them may sound good, but they're not necessarily effective ways to go around agricultural systems and the like that I worked with at AID. Others do show promise, and we should absolutely pursue them. But you know, it takes some real you know, bare bones. Let me back up, and my point on this is we need to follow the science. It's a topic that can be so emotional, and you can fall into things. Well, let's try this, and that sounds good, but we need science-based solutions to the problem, because it's a problem that's only science can really help get us through. And on some of them, there's still scientific disagreement, which we'll have to navigate as well, which is complicated. But you know, there's only going to be so much money to respond to it. And I think it needs to be in the trillions of dollars. You know, we're talking about billions right now. I think we're looking at a multi-trillion-dollar expense over a period of decades to really start being able to transition our economies to effectively reduce the consequences of greenhouse gases.
Anya, who is our intern, and Jill of all trades, she says, as a young person, don't worry, we're definitely involved in fighting climate change. So
great to hear that. I think she's right. I've met a lot of young people. I mentioned Greta earlier, but there's many, many more out there that are, you know, really active, and I think they get it much better. It's like the programming your VCR, you know, it's just something that some of us have difficulty with, but they've gotten it and are working on it.
True, true. A question, please explain the relationship between climate change and the pandemic in more detail.
So I mentioned earlier that we've been preparing the international humanitarian community and the domestic disaster response community has been preparing for a pandemic for at least 2 decades now. I mean, longer than that, but seriously for 2 decades. It's kind of an interesting history. It was one of the elements that it really got started when George Bush apparently read a sci-fi novel about a pandemic. And to his credit, he externalized that and tried to, you know, look at a practical response. And he was the one who helped create, he wasn't the only one, but he helped create the National Strategic Stockpile, which was a stockpile of PPE, personal protective equipment like masks and gowns and the like, that were such a problem in the early days of the pandemic. And during the Obama administration, you had multiple epidemics globally. You obviously had the Ebola crisis, but you had SARS and MERS. And the stockpile was reduced considerably, and it was expensive to maintain the stockpile. There's a shelf life on masks of about 5 years. There were billions of masks in the stockpile. And quite a bit of money was spent on a machine that would be able to rapidly manufacture the mask. And I'm not an expert on that, but apparently there were problems. There were some aspects of fraud related to it. Some people say it would have worked, but the machine never got up and running. Congress never appropriated the money to restock the stockpile. I mean, it's those things that happen in every crisis, and it's so frustrating to practitioners. And so it's the system itself that failed, I think, in that case, that our stockpile, and it put so many health workers at grave risk. And we saw this in the Ebola crisis as well in West Africa, where just one organization, MSF, lost 19 doctors in the early days of that crisis that they sent out to help. It also goes to look at what happened. There's a wonderful talk by a Marin resident, Dr. Larry Brilliant, from, I think it's 2006. And he's talked about preparing for, he was a really seminal influence in terms of helping eradicate smallpox. And he discusses the importance of early warning systems. He describes a pandemic almost nailing exactly what happened, originating in a market in China, and it was pretty much exactly what we just faced. And that was in 2006. And there are many others. Bill Gates gave a talk years ago, and many other people gave talks that really, knew what was likely to happen and did happen. Yet, we knew in Larry's talk, he talks about, imagine, getting on a plane during a pandemic. Nobody's going to do it. And we're going to see global air travel shut down, which it pretty much virtually did. And for humanitarians, we have to prepare for crises where it's like in Iraq, where we had to pull out most of our staff and manage the crisis remotely. We did not do well enough preparing for the implications of this. Now, today's talk was about equity. Look at the global vaccine situation. The wealthiest countries, United States at the forefront, are fortunately getting their vaccines while the rest of the world is going to still be a long way off. And it's absolutely the case that until the rest of the world is vaccinated, we're all still going to be at risk. New variants will emerge. Hopefully we'll be able to manage those with booster shots and the like. But still, it's something that we really are in it together, like with climate change, with a pandemic. Until the virus is suppressed globally, it's going to remain a threat. And I can go on, but procurement, there's so many things that we do daily in disaster response that were relevant and fell apart in response to this particular pandemic that are lessons learned for us for the massive crises that we're going to be facing in the years to come.
Let me see here. Question, there are so many ways to fight climate change, but a limitation on money to save our kids and grandkids. Where do you suggest we go to help us prioritize our spending?
Well, I'm not, honestly an expert in that. I mean, I think what I think is there's, you can't just focus on, I mentioned 3 elements: mitigation, adaptation, and then preparedness. And you can't singly focus on one, but most of the money, I believe, should go into mitigation. Because unless we're able to deal with reducing the threat, then it's going to be out of control, and whatever we do to adapt to it is probably going to fall, even further short than it will. So the focus should be on mitigation, and that's everything from transitioning our economy to away from fossil fuels, to revamping our agricultural systems, to the numerous major drivers of greenhouse gases. And then in adaptation, I think there's a lot out there in terms of, like I said, systems that for a relatively little amount of money, we've got the research that will show impact. And we should certainly look at that. And preparedness is something that's largely been ignored. And I think that needs to receive more attention. How can we better prepare ourselves? I mean, you think of the poor director of Marine Community Health, Matt Willis, and what he's faced in the last 12 to 14 months and all the challenges we faced here in Marin alone. And that's happening, around the country and globally. And we need to build in some resiliency in those systems in order to be able, because, he's done an amazing job. A lot of people have done an amazing job, but still, if we had more resources to lead these crises, to manage them more effectively, we'll be better off from that as well. I think, I don't want to point to any one particular thing, but there's so many things. And there's also, I didn't mention, we were facing huge climate change disasters now. And there's organizations out there that are responding to vulnerable populations in need. So there's just so many things. I'm not going to nail one down, but those would be my priorities in terms of where we should allocate money. And, how much? As much as we can get, because it's going to take a lot to get us there. Now, I think on the more optimistic side, there's a lot of people saying that the economy can grow with this as well by creating new types of jobs, new industries, and I think that's true. And we're not going to be able to transition it overnight. And there's a lot of very complex questions like nuclear, the involvement of nuclear power in this. And wind energy has its, every technology virtually has its downside as well. And we have to look at that in terms of the manufacturing costs of items as well, and what that contributes to greenhouse gases. But science-based, look at the experts, and we allocate our money based on research.
Yeah. Lynn, you asked a question. I'm not quite sure I understand it. Are you there?
I am. And I think, actually, I think that my same question was asked by someone else here. Oh, Jody Timms, can you help us understand what radical political changes we need? That was kind of my question as well.
Well, I mean, that's a complex question, but to put it in very crude terms, I mean, I think the way politics works, not just in the United States, but in every country, is you have interests that are served. And sometimes those are the interests of the common good, and oftentimes are the interests of special interests. And for the most part, I think the United States, a lot of our political focus is on special interests. Why does the oil and gas industry receive subsidies at a time when they're really part of a root problem for climate change? Because they've got good lobbyists and because there's special interests involved. And until our politicians can finally decide that their job is not to, create perpetual jobs for themselves in Congress and service those who help them get elected, but to serve the common good, we're in deep trouble. And unfortunately, I think, and I'm not speaking universally here, certainly think there's individual politicians that stand out serving the common good, and there's individual actions politicians that take that I think deserve commendation for serving the common good. But we're a long way from being at the point where we're in a bipartisan way or multi-partisan way, if we have multiple parties that emerge from this little disaster we're going through now, that really look at what's in the best interests of our future generations and our planet to get through this crisis. And that's a radical change from where we are.
Yeah. Nancy, was your question answered, or were you still?
Not really. So, Mark,
Sorry, I'll try again. Let's see if I can understand.
No, we hadn't gotten to it yet. I wasn't sure if you had included that.
you've talked a lot about mitigation, and a lot of the strategies here in Marin are focused on mitigation also, particularly reducing greenhouse gases. What we don't hear a lot about is adaptation. This is my worry, is we are far down the road here with climate change, not having done what we needed to do a lot sooner. And we are going to have to accept the fact that we can't fix this, and we can't save every place, that there are going to have to be some really strong adaptation strategies where people are going to have to be willing to change the way they live. One of the taglines we've used for our committee is climate change needs human change. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts and comments might be in regards to focusing on adaptation.
Sure. Well, but I think you're absolutely right in everything you've just said. And, one example that we know the community who focus on climate change knows is that Miami is going to be underwater. And yet there's still real estate sales going on, and, within the next 20 years. Maybe they'll come up with some sort of adaptation. In Venice, Venice is, of course, facing the same kind of problem. And they may come up with some kind of adaptation. Venice, they're working on a multi-billion-dollar gate system that's had all sorts of problems. But there's those types of issues. Here in Marin, there are no doubt communities that are simply unsustainable or would be so expensive to, I'm not gonna, I hate to point out anybody, but I can think of a few out where I live, West Marin. And, the resources may or may not be there. So the county as a permitting agency is going to have to look at that, I think, what makes sense in terms of where homes should be built and where it doesn't make sense. More complex issues, even than that, I think, though, going back to our fire situation, look at the exodus we've seen from California due to insurance companies pulling out or raising rates, unbelievably high. And my understanding is many insurance companies now are just developing lottery systems where they're reducing their exposure to the point where they can guarantee they'll make money even if there are major fires. And a lot more people are about to lose their insurance. And even the insurance regime that we've created is very, very expensive. And, that has sociological implications for the county. We're already a very wealthy county, obviously. But those of us who are not in that stratosphere are going to find it even more difficult to live in this county, looking at those kinds of issues. And insurance is a big issue globally as well. There's a lot of insurers that are looking at getting involved in climate change. And my own personal opinion is that, yeah, it can help for a while, but unless we are able to mitigate the impacts of climate change, at some point they'll start losing money, and insurance isn't going to be a viable route through that either. But that's kind of what we're facing right now with fires. And I know there's some legislation that Senator Levine has introduced that looks at mandating certain requirements for insurance companies, and maybe that's viable. I don't know, but insurance companies will need to make money. They're not going to stay in business if they can't make some money. But those are really complex political decisions that are extant today and having very real life impacts for many of us here in Marin. But I think your point about adaptation, I know there's communities that we know are going to face huge consequences with sea level rise, and there's erosion on the cliffs along our coast due to climate change related events. There's homes in forests like mine. I live in a forest that make it extremely complicated to maintain. These are all really huge challenges that we're facing.
Thank you, Mark. And just a little plug real quick for everybody. Our climate change speaker series, as we've mentioned, is going to be bringing in Marin experts on these various topics, including Drawdown Marin, which is kind of the umbrella program. That'll be our May speaker. And then learning more about Bay Wave and Sea Smart, which is all about our adaptation and mitigation vulnerability assessments for the coast and the bay side. So I just encourage everybody to pay attention as we send out information about who our speakers will be, because a lot of what we're talking about here on a larger scale, we will be talking about on our own county scale more locally, and who's doing what and how that's going. Thanks.
And Anya had another question.
Sure.
She's currently at the College of Marin when she's not helping us out. And
Not at the College of Marin, but
what's that?
I go to HS 1327.
Oh, okay, great.
That's
Did you want to ask your question?
Oh,
Because I'm
sure,
going to
yeah.
flub it. I'm going to flub it.
Thanks so much, Linda. Okay, yeah. So I'm a senior, and I'm going to the University of St. Andrews next year, and in my APES class, I love my teacher a lot. She's really interesting, and she tries to include a lot of information that isn't, the direct curriculum, but of course it's super relevant. So she showed us this article at the beginning of the year talking about how with the melting of permafrost, we are like unearthing these viruses that had been underground for years. And we really just briefly covered it, but you seem like you have such a bevy of information. I would love to hear more about, if you know about this. I believe it was in the Arctic Circle and from decomposing caribou, I think, or something. And so there were these viruses, and then the permafrost melted, and then they're coming up into water. I don't know if that was it.
You explained it pretty well, I think. Actually, I do know about it, and yes, it's a real fear of that there will be new viruses that are unearthed as permafrost melts. But even, well, as worrying as that is, as the permafrost melts, it will release methane. And many climate scientists believe it will be the tipping point when that starts to happen, that there may be no coming back from that. So it's a very scary analysis when you look at some of the writing on this. But when the permafrost is melting, we're in deep trouble. And pandemics certainly could be one impact, but the methane release is even more concern, I think, to many in terms of what that could promote. But that was a good question, and you nailed it. Good luck in your next iteration in college.
Right. And I guess our last question is the point raised, hold it, excuse me. I just lost my place. Sorry about that.
Can I ask a quick question in the
Sure.
meantime?
Yes.
I will not be as eloquent as the high school senior, who's quite eloquent, but I just read something about, because cows, right, are notorious for putting methane in the atmosphere, and that they were talking about if they added to their diet red seaweed. Okay, so I heard this on NPR, wasn't a crackpot thing. I haven't had time to look it up, and I just thought it just popped into my head as she was talking about, you know, melting and things coming up. Do you know anything about that? Is there any validity to that, or you heard anything about
I'm
that?
not enough knowledgeable. I've heard about it, but I'm not knowledgeable enough to have an opinion one way or another on it. I mean, I do know that with methane in cows, there are biodigesters that even some ranches in Marin, they're very expensive, but have purchased. And I'm not an expert in that either, but I think that it does have some potential promise. Interestingly, I'll mention something that'll be controversial because I am somewhat knowledgeable about this topic, but there's a process that a lot of people in the agricultural industry like to promote called regenerative ranching. And it involves rotational grazing. It was developed in large part by a man named Alan Savory. And I've had experience with that, and it's been funded by both USAID and USDA. And in both instances, they didn't find it scientifically viable. Yet it's still a huge talking point among the ranching community as something that is going to save us from climate change. And you know, I can tell you from my years at USAID, if there's any organization in the US government that is hell-bent on trying to save and promote food security around the world for the world's most vulnerable, it's USAID. And I met with him, and you know, it sounded great, and but it did not prove scientifically viable. And the claims are made that, well, science is behind and all this. And you know, I think we have to be science-based in how we approach these questions. So you know, there's very controversial issues like that, but the seaweed one, I don't know enough about. I think, you know, all these kinds of things that deserve, you know, some seed funding to see if there's a there. You know, I know that in Marin, there's organizations looking at carbon sequestration and farming and the like. And, you know, from what I've read, and I'm not an expert on this topic, it has some promise. It may be being oversold a bit in terms of how much of a factor it could be in reversing certain elements of climate change, but you know, it may have enough promise to certainly continue to pursue. So those are issues I leave up to scientists, and on regenerative ranching, that was something that I trust the scientists I was working with. They just didn't find the validity there.
Okay, and this will be our last question. I heard someone from the Marin County Department of Public Works speak a couple of years ago regarding sea level rise. They are talking about adaptation, but not mitigation at all. Who is, I think that's changed a little in the last few years, but she was asking who is working on mitigation in Marin. Is there any political will to attempt mitigation efforts? I think that's the main point there.
Well, I mean, I know the county is working on mitigation. When you read the county plan, as I have, they talk about their interest in mitigating the impacts of climate change, as well as on adaptation. Yet they adopt policies that are in direct contravention of those goals. So, you know, that's the politics I'm talking about. It's one thing to say something. It's quite another to actually carry through and make the tough decisions that need to be made to make change. And unfortunately, in the county of Marin, on a couple of issues, and again, I'm sure there's a million things they're doing that I'm not aware of, that I don't want to speak generically, but at least on a couple of issues, their rhetoric is not being followed up with policy.
Okay. And I think we've covered it pretty well. And I thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me. And like I said, as I began, you know, I really think that your group is really one of the important ones in terms of, I'm really happy that you're engaged in this issue, and I had a lot of good questions. And I think when groups like this, you know, get involved and can start talking with politicians, that's going to be really helpful in terms of trying to change that dynamic I mentioned. So thanks for all your work.
Yeah. Well, one of the main focuses we're doing this with all these talks is to find out where we could put our voice and to make the most effort. Anything?
Susan Stomp had a question.
Oh, sorry. Point Reyes Seashore is not increasing, she's underlined that, ranching. It's proposed to be even more controlled than in the past. Challenging our local food security is not an answer. We do need to address our lifestyle and important personal responsibility. Less gas, more clean practice energy.
So she asked it, I will answer it. First of all, food security, I wouldn't call what our ranches produce in Marin our food security. From a global health perspective and food security perspective, it's about affordability. And our food produced by our local ranches is wonderful. I'm not denigrating it in any way, but it's very expensive. It's not relevant to our food security. As they're not increasing ranching, they're introducing pigs, goats, sheep, guard dogs, they're killing native tule elk, they're polluting the environment, and they're putting more pressure on the wildlife and biodiversity that currently exists in the park. So to say that's not increasing your footprint, I think is a stretch. They're not increasing the scale of the cattle on the land, that is accurate. But they are increasing ranching in terms of they're going to be doing mobile slaughtering of animals, selling the products on the ranches. It will definitely have a significant impact in terms of biodiversity, and I think as well as climate change in terms of the new animals, non-native animals we bring into the park. So sorry, I disagree with you.
Agree to disagree.
Yeah. But thanks again for inviting me. And again, I just want to thank you for your work. I think it's critical.
Great. Thank you so much for your time, Mark.
Sure.
Take
Thank
care.
you, Mark.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
so much, Mark. Thank you. It was wonderful, so interesting, but honestly, you've given us even more to worry about. than we had. This is so big.
It is
And
big.
thinking about it globally, it's hard to know from, as a person, where to even begin.
Yeah.
Can I chime in on that one, Ann?
I should probably let you guys
Mark.
talk about it now. I'll depart. But yeah, I agree with you. It's big, and that's one of the challenges. But you have to start somewhere, and I think your group is absolutely doing that, and that's the important thing. But there are definitely so many elements to this. So I'm going to sign off. But best of luck to you guys, and happy to have discussions with you in the future too. Take good care.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Really
Thank you,
appreciate
Mark.
it.
Bye.
Anne, if I could just respond to what you just said, as far as what we're doing locally, before we can, what was I going to say? We have to know where we are before we know where we want to go. And that's what our climate change speaker series is about. And I know I'm sounding repetitious, but I'm just going to put this one out there. Our May speaker will be Alex Portershover, who heads up Drawdown Marin, which is our county government's overarching plan to address climate change in Marin. So that'll be our May speaker, Alex Portershover, on Drawdown Marin. And so this is where you can learn more about what's going on. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Nancy. Okay, before everyone signs off, I know Doug wants to tell you about our Monday member meeting. Are you still here, Doug?
Okay, so this will be May 3rd, and the Health Committee is the one to host this meeting. And we are very, very fortunate to get Ash Kalra, who's the primary author of AB 1400, to come speak to us. AB 1400 is the California Guaranteed Health Care for All Act, which has come to be called CalCare casually. So he is the primary author. He's the assembly person representing San Jose. Among his three primary co-authors is Mike McGuire, who will also be joining this session. He's our state senator representing Marin all the way up to the Oregon border. Sonoma County League's also being invited to join in this. And between the two of them, they're going to tell us about what's in AB 1400, what its prospects are, the challenges, and their political strategy to move this forward. As you probably remember, California's had a number of attempts at getting single payer for a statewide system without waiting for the US as a whole. And we've come very, very close. So maybe we'll be able to push this one through now that we have a friendly administration with our own former Attorney General Becerra as the new Health and Human Services Secretary. We can probably get the kinds of waivers that we need to actually make a go of this. So this will be a fascinating lecture, and I hope we get a good turnout of people and don't disappoint these wonderful speakers.
We won't disappoint them, Doug. We'll be there.
Good.
Thank you, everyone. That was great. Thank you all for coming, and we will see you, if not sooner, we'll see you May 3rd.